Okay, I think we'll get started here in just a moment. Thank you for those of you who could tune in. I'm going to hand it over to Jason Kephart from Colorado State University, and he'll be talking today about band alignment of front contact layers for high efficiency CAD Telluride solar cells. Jason, please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, thanks, John. So, like you said, my name is Jason Kephart. I'm a research scientist here at CSU. I work for Dr. Sampath in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. And today I'm going to be talking about a lot of my PhD work in developing front contacts for cadmium telluride solar cells. I'm going to begin today's talk by discussing the need for cadmium telluride thin film photovoltaics. After that, I'd like to discuss how we make our baseline process devices in the lab, and then discuss some modifications I've made to that process to improve the efficiency. And I'll finish up with a few conclusions. So we all know the energy challenge, which is that we need to get global energy to zero carbon as quickly as possible. When you look at renewable sources of energy, there's one resource that stands out, and there's no doubt that solar power is sufficient to meet all the energy needs of the world well into the future. Other resources like wind or biomass may come close, but it would be difficult to develop them to the level that they could provide all of our energy. So solar is really the only number that's big enough. Looking at the cost of photovoltaic electricity generation, for residential systems, and I think this paper is based on silicon, in many markets, the levelized cost of energy for solar is below the retail cost of electricity. You can see the difference here of 2012 versus 2015 modeling, but it's probably well below that at this point. For utility scale, thin film cadmium telluride PV is the lowest cost, and industry leader First Solar has shown that their costs are well in line with coal and nuclear generation in the United States. So why would we want to use cadmium telluride instead of silicon, which is a proven decades-old technology? If you look at a panel made by, say, Trina Solar, it's a very complex process. You have to get extremely pure polysilicon, cast the silicon, saw it, slice it, etc. And that's just to make a cell. And then you have to take the cells and solder them together and encapsulate them into a module. All these processes are dependent on billions of dollars of capital, which has largely been provided by the Chinese government. And this has been ruled illegal dumping by the World Trade Organization. So if we really want an energy solution, we can't be relying on subsidies. Silicon modules are also sensitive to high temperatures and low light conditions, and their efficiency, the record efficiency, has not been improving very quickly. If you contrast this with a cadmium telluride panel made by First Solar, it's a much simpler process. You start by depositing a few layers, thin films, onto glass, and then you interconnect this layer into many cells to create a higher voltage module. To encapsulate the module, you bond a second piece of glass onto the back. This process is much less capital intensive. And because we're using a 2,6 direct gap semiconductor, the material can be 100 times thinner. And we can make a good enough material with polycrystalline films to make a good device. This is the lowest cost photovoltaic technology. It also has better field performance per watt of rated power because it is less sensitive to high temperatures and low light conditions. The efficiency is also over 18% for the record module now, which is better than polycrystalline silicon. And the energy payback time is lower, which means the energy that went into manufacturing the module can be made back by putting the module out in the field for only 6 months. I'd now like to discuss how we make our baseline devices in our lab. Here's a schematic of a baseline device, and it starts with a piece of soda-lime glass that's coated with fluorine-doped tin oxide. This TCO material is very low cost and robust, and it's actually deposited at the glass factory. The front contact structure, which is responsible for collecting electrons from the device, almost always has a cadmium sulfide layer, and this can be deposited by a variety of techniques. And it also has a high resistive transparent layer sometimes, which is an oxide that goes between the TCO and the cadmium sulfide. The cadmium telluride absorber is usually deposited by a thermal technique with the substrate held at high temperature between 450 to 650 degrees Celsius. The absorber is almost always in yielding cadmium chloride at about 400 degrees Celsius, and this passivates the absorber, improving the efficiency. To make a back contact to the device, the back surface of the cadmium telluride is doped with copper, and traditionally we've put a carbon-containing paint at the back surface. But based on some work reported by the University of Rochester, I developed a evaporated tellurium back contact, which is very simple and seems to work better. To deposit all these layers, we have a variety of fabrication tools in our lab. The first system, which does all the sublimation-based processing, is called the Advanced Research Deposition System. And it has an automated magnetic transfer arm, which is computer controlled. It can move the substrate through a variety of sources. We also have capability to do magnetron sputtering while controlling the gas composition, and ion beam sputtering for deposition of other oxide materials. To deposit ternary absorbers such as cadmium magnesium telluride, we use a co-sublimation process. Going into more detail on the advanced deposition system, you see a schematic here of this automated transfer arm. And when a piece of glass is put into the load block and introduced into the chamber, it can be put into any source in any sequence, but typically we preheat the sample, deposit cadmium sulfide, cadmium telluride, perform the cadmium chloride process, allow the device to cool somewhat, and dope the back surface with copper. Here you can see a model of our source, and it features a top and bottom graphite crucible with embedded resistive heaters. The bottom source can be filled with a sublimation material, and the top source helps control the substrate temperature. And both of these sources are controlled to a fraction of a degree C. When the end effector introduces the substrate into our source, the sublimation happens onto the glass as seen here, and the top is removed here for clarity. Looking at this baseline device, which is 12 to 13% efficient, there's plenty of room for improvement. First of all the layers in front of the absorber can also absorb light, but this light is not converted into current, so it's parasitic. The cadmium sulfide is especially problematic in this regard since it absorbs strongly above its band gap of 2.4 eV. At any interface where there's a refractive index difference, there can be reflection. And the cadmium telluride is far from perfect. It has grain boundaries, point defects and impurities, stacking faults, many defects that increase recombination and reduce the voltage of the device. The interfaces of cadmium telluride are also not perfect, and if there are problems with band alignment, that can impede the collection of carriers. Also, interface recombination can lower the device efficiency. These two elements are the ones I'm going to be talking about mostly today. Now I'm going to transition into discussing modifications that we've made to our baseline process to improve efficiency. The first method we've done this is by adding a high resistance transparent layer. So here you can see a HRT has been added between the TCO and the cadmium sulfide. This is oxide, which is more resistive than the TCO, but still quite conductive, and it enables a thinner cadmium sulfide layer. The existing theory for why this occurs is due to pinholes in the cadmium sulfide. And if you have this resistant layer present, it can provide an ohmic block to shunting current and therefore reduce the degradation of the device. Now, we've made thousands of devices on a variety of materials, and we don't think this theory really tells the whole story of what the HRT is doing.
What's HRT? High resistive layer.
So we tested a variety of materials in collaboration with PPG Industries that were all based on tin oxide. And we tested tin oxide with different types of CVD precursors and alloyed with different elements. And these were fairly dilute alloys of zinc, gallium, and indium with tin oxide. And we also tested making the fluorinated tin oxide more resistive by co-doping with nitrogen. We also tried various thickness and compositions. Compared to the baseline devices, the VOC and fill factor are preserved with lower cadmium sulfide thickness when an HRT is present. And this can be seen here as the cadmium sulfide thickness is reduced. The HRT-containing devices maintain VOC to a lower thickness. And there's also an effect with the fill factor. The reason we would want to do this is the steady increase of current with thinner cad sulfide. You can see that for the optimum without and with HRT, that we get a slightly higher optimum efficiency, and this occurs at a thinner cadmium sulfide. Looking at the JV curves of these devices, we do see a slightly lower VOC at optimum, but higher current with the HRT. And then this is indicative of the trade-off that we have between voltage and current. Another way to improve the front contact is a material called oxygenated cadmium sulfide. And this is made by RF sputter deposition. So there's a cadmium sulfide target with plasma, and it deposits cadmium sulfide under the glass. If we precisely control the oxygen as a ratio of argon, we can introduce oxygen into the film. This was developed by NREL in the early 2000s. And when increased oxygen incorporation in the film, we see increased transmission for wavelengths below 500 nanometers. We also see that the grain size is reduced, so it's a nanocrystalline or amorphous film. And typically there's a sulfur diffusion from the window layer into the cadmium telluride, and this is inhibited. Finally, this layer has higher resistivity with higher oxygen. And NREL only demonstrated this device on a cadmium stannate, zinc stannate, TCO and HRT stack. So we wanted to demonstrate this material on a commercial tin oxide substrate. We used our optimized HRT layer from our previous work. And as we increased the oxygen, we could clearly see the increase in transmission as we increased the oxygen composition. For as-deposited films, there's a steady increase in transmission, but when these devices films are annealed to the cadmium telluride process temperatures, many of these revert back to a similar transmission to the plain cadmium sulfide, where above a threshold value, they remain transparent over the entire region. Looking at the chemical composition of this film in XPS, we see that as we add oxygen, this sulfur 2P peak decreases while this one increases. And this one corresponds to sulfate and sulfite, where this is sulfide. The presence of sulfate material helps explain the increased transmission. And of course, we made many devices on these films with different compositions and thicknesses. As we increase the oxygen content from 0 to 1%, we see an improvement in voltage and fill factor. And it should be said, this is not like our normal cadmium sulfide because it's sputter deposited at room temperature. When we go from 1 to 2%, we see a large increase in the short circuit current of the device. And as we add more oxygen, we see a secondary barrier known as a JV kink. And this becomes so pronounced that almost no current can pass through the device. It should be noted that we've tried this with and without the HRT layer, and we absolutely need this HRT layer for this material to work. You can see in the QE that the increase in current is clearly due to the transmission of the window layer. Over here at longer wavelengths, there's little difference between low oxygen and high oxygen. And then at 2%, you see a strong increase for blue light. And as the secondary barrier occurs, you see a reduction in QE across the spectrum. Another way to control this barrier or kink is by changing the thickness of the window layer. So if you have a thick 130 nanometer window layer and reduce it down to 90 and then 50 nanometers, you can eliminate the kink behavior. If you make it too thin, you see a reduction in open circuit voltage. And interestingly, the voltage increases steadily with oxygen content. If you compare this to a device with sublimated cadmium sulfide over a range of temperature, you see that the slopes are essentially the same, but the intercepts are different by about 40 to 50 millivolts. And this is a combination of both the higher bandgap absorber due to the lack of sulfur interdiffusion, as well as reduced interface recombination. So the third sort of family of materials we tried to improve the front contact is magnesium zinc oxide. Zinc oxide is very commonly used along with tin oxide as a high resistance transparent layer. But by itself, it makes fairly low efficiency devices. When you add magnesium to the zinc oxide, you increase the band gap, and this can be seen in this talc plot by devices made here. If you start with pure zinc oxide, the band gap is about 3.2 eV, but as you add more weight percent magnesium oxide to the target, you see an increase in the band gap. The material also remains in a single phase up to about 0.4, at which point the cubic phase can start to precipitate. Adding magnesium reduces the lattice constant of the MZO, which can increase the lattice mismatch with cadmium telluride. And another important property is that it reduces the electron affinity. In this study by Rao et al., a MZO layer with a composition of 0.15 had a flat conduction band alignment with cadmium sulfide, whereas zinc oxide had a higher electron affinity by 0.3 eV. And again, we made many devices varying the composition and thickness of this layer. We see similar behavior to the oxygenated cadmium sulfide. As you alloy more into the film, you see an increase in open circuit voltage from pure zinc oxide to low magnesium to higher magnesium. You also can see a slight improvement in fill factor, but the secondary barrier occurs for the thicker films, which reduces the fill factor. And you see high current due to the very high band gap and good transmission of this film. When the secondary barrier becomes very pronounced, the current can be reduced. But in this preliminary study, we got an average of 15% for all the devices on one substrate. And like I said before, you can produce a secondary barrier and also increase the current. Showing the JV curves, you really just see the same behavior. Start with a low VOC, which is improved, and then a secondary barrier appears. So from all this behavior, it seems that band alignment is quite important to the device performance. If you make a simple 1D model in SCAPS, and you start with a high electron affinity oxide, with an interface that has high recombination, you can get a very low open circuit voltage and some interface recombination. As you make a flat and then slightly positive conduction band offset or spike, you see a steady improvement in these properties. And if the spike becomes too large, you can see a secondary barrier. And this is exactly what we've seen with both of the materials. We also have seen with the HRT layer a wide variety of VOC. So we wanted to measure the electron affinity of these layers, and we used ultraviolet photoelectron spectroscopy. And on the same films, we made 3 sets of devices. One had no cadmium sulfide, another set had 50 nanometers of oxygenated cadmium sulfide, and a third set had 50 nanometers of sublimated cad sulfide. The electron affinity measured by UPS correlates strongly with the open circuit voltage and fill factor. And here I've plotted the UPS results against the average VOC of devices. Without cadmium sulfide, when the oxide is directly contacting the cadmium telluride, there's a very strong effect. And this effect becomes weaker for oxygenated cadmium sulfide and sublimated cadmium sulfide, but is still present. You can see some of the HRT layers, such as the nitrogen and fluorine-doped tin oxide, that have a high electron affinity but are much more resistive than the TCO, still produce very similar results. So to summarize these 3 approaches, HRT layers are a partial solution to the band alignment problems. But anytime you're using cadmium sulfide with a low band gap of 2.4 eV, you always have a trade-off of voltage and current. The 2 materials we looked at, oxygenated cadmium sulfide and MZO, both produce high efficiency. They both have a tunable conduction band that can be used to improve VOC, and their high transmission improves the JSC. Also for these 2 materials, we see less interdiffusion, so of either sulfur or magnesium or zinc. We really don't see any into the cadmium telluride. There are a variety of reasons that MZO is the better material. First, we're not sure that any sort of sulfate is a good material to be in a commercial solar module. It's very sensitive to water. And also it relies on a reactive process, which is difficult to do on large scales. But here, the magnesium to zinc ratio is fixed by the ratio of oxides in the target. So this is much simpler and much easier to do repeatably. It's also one less process that has to be in containment. And an interesting effect is that the MZO seems to work without a separate HRT layer, which is not possible with the oxygenated cadmium sulfide. So there's been an evolution of a variety of front contacts in our laboratory. We started off with this baseline device with 12 to 13% efficiency. We added an HRT and a thinner cadmium sulfide layer and made a slight improvement in efficiency. By changing the cadmium sulfide to oxygenated cadmium sulfide, we saw an increase in voltage and current, leading to efficiencies we measured over 16%. And finally, the MZO window layer produces similar efficiencies, but has the advantages I mentioned before, and maintains the simplicity of the original 12% device. Of course, the window layer serves as a growth template for the absorber, and so how the cadmium telluride grows on the MZO is very interesting. This is a project done by Amit in our lab through the IUCRC, and he was trying to make high temperature cadmium telluride, but at the low pressures we use, the cadmium sulfide can resublimate at very high temperature, but the MZO is very stable. We also see that the MZO seems to follow the roughness of the TCO quite closely, which is desirable. And by depositing at higher temperatures, Amit has been able to get these large grains that can go all the way from the front to the back of the device. So going from this MZO device with otherwise baseline process, we did a number of improvements to further increase the efficiency. I created a 4-layer anti-reflection coating based on some work done at Loughborough University. And this layer is fully optically modeled in MATLAB and optimized to the AM 1.5 spectrum. We also replaced the carbon paint with the tellurium back contact that I discussed. And Amit produced the high-temperature cadmium Telluride process that he has seen improvements with. And this produced an 18.3% device, which is our laboratory record. You can see it has a VOC of over 860 millivolts, which is fairly close to the best devices being made. The current is almost 27 milliamps per centimeter squared, which is an improvement from about 21 for our baseline device. And before we went to this high temperature cadmium Telluride, we couldn't make a fill factor much above 76, so this is really a large improvement. You can see the quantum efficiency is over 90% over a wide wavelength range, and this decrease is primarily due to the anti-reflection coating. I'd like to again stress that this device uses only high throughput manufacturable techniques, and it's not much more complicated than the 12% devices we used to make. Looking forward, there are a lot of opportunities to further improve the device, and we're interested in some advanced structures such as a CMT electron reflector and other bandgap modification approaches like a graded bandgap solar cell. Further in the future, we envision being able to make a triple junction tandem solar cell using ternary alloys of cadmium telluride. So I'd like to conclude today's presentation by saying that cadmium telluride photovoltaics are currently a cost-effective energy solution. So anything we can do to improve the efficiency while maintaining the scalability of this technology could make it the cheapest form of electricity, period, with no carbon pollution. On the research that I've done, replacing cadmium sulfide with a better front contact can really improve the efficiency quite a lot. The manufacturing process has stayed simple, and other approaches to using tunable alloys could offer further improvements in device efficiency. Here are some of our team members, and I'm sure I've left many people out, but I also appreciate their contributions. And now I can answer any of your questions. Yeah, I see a question.
Thank you very much, Jason.
So.
I see there's a question in the chat window from Doug Pernick, and he wondered if the HRT would prevent the electron extraction from the cad sulfide.
Yeah, so it could if the band alignment were, if the electron affinity of that layer were so low that there was a large positive offset, it could prevent the electrons from being extracted. And also, if the layer were a complete insulator, that would be a problem. But when we say high resistance, it's really relative to the TCO. So these materials are about 1 ohm centimeter, which is quite conductive. Doug's asking, how thick do you make the layer? The optimum tin oxide HRT was 150 nanometers, and the optimal cad sulfide would be about 60 nanometers with that layer. The MZO, which would be the only layer present, we're using 100 nanometers. Any other questions? questions? Roger has a question. Are we going to use UTA proposal on alternate layers? I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Hey John, can you hear me? This is Brian.
Hi, Brian. Yes, you're on the line.
Oh, okay, I just saw Raji's question there, and so yeah, we're still planning on discussing that. We've had some discussions here at UT. I was talking to Tim and Doug Pernick about and Dan and Vikas about some of the materials and how we might do that. So we're planning on doing that for sure. Looking forward to it. It's challenging.
Yeah, so we have all of the tunable window layers, and we can certainly use them for other absorbers, or look at even other window layers with these tunable conduction bands that might be even better than the MZO. Jing asks, why do you need 100 nanometer thick MZO? Does thickness matter for band alignment? It's an interesting question. I don't think we fully understand the difference between a thick and thin layer and why it matters for band alignment. Certainly these layers are very resistive. When we've tried to do Hall measurements on the MZO, we can't even measure it. So there's a very low carrier concentration, which means the bands aren't necessarily fixed in one place. They can move based on the band alignment of the other layer, being the TCO. But we've repeatedly seen with the oxygenated cadmium sulfide and the MZO that making the layer thicker has a similar behavior to reducing the electron affinity.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions? I know there was at least one or two people on the phone. If there's anyone on the phone line who'd like to ask a question, please feel free as well. Okay, well, it sounds like there's probably not any other questions, so just wanted to take a chance to thank Jason once again for his time and effort in putting together this presentation. Please join us again in the future. We'll continue our distinguished lecture series, and we look forward to having you all join us again. Thanks again, Jason.
Yeah, thanks everyone.